Thank you very much. So I'm wearing two hats. One is my IUCN hat, and I suspect that a fair number of you here from different governments and organizations are actually members of IUCN, so you'll already know a little bit about us, but we are a member-based organization, a union of members with over 1,100 members and offices around the world. We have been doing a fair bit of work on landscape and ecosystem approaches for a number of years now, both in the field and at the policy level. I'll also briefly mention the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration, which I coordinate and which is hosted by IUCN. It's an informal partnership of about 30 governments, international and non-governmental organizations who are jointly committed to promoting forest landscape restoration, to developing tools for practitioners, and building additional support. I don't take direction well, so I won't address Hosny's 3 questions directly, but I will address some elements of those questions. In particular, in order to look forward, let's look briefly at where we are now. What's our basis for moving forward? What's the status of landscape approaches now? What's our common understanding of them? What policy results have we already seen? And then how can we build on that to secure future policy relevant lessons and additional policy influence? It was very interesting to me to come to this conference and not hear anyone say, what is a landscape? Because every other place I've been to where there has been this issue discussed, people have said, I'm not quite sure what this means. It's not completely clear in English. It's even less clear in French and Spanish and other languages. It's very heartening and encouraging in moving forward into the future to see that there seems to be a much stronger common understanding now of this idea, of this approach, and there has been for quite some time. There's a number of elements, as you know. How do you draw the lines on a map of what's a landscape? All these different factors are relevant: biophysical, cultural, psychological, political, economic, and others. There are important governance issues that arise. Do administrative and legal jurisdictions fit with the landscapes? Also participation issues. Once you define what your landscape is, that helps you to map out all the different stakeholders that need to be involved. In IUCN and with our partners, we've come to see a landscape as being something, the scale at which it is necessary to intervene in order to balance trade-offs and optimize benefit flows. At a site level, not everybody can get what they want. But maybe at a landscape level, when you scale up, you can arrive at some optimal and balanced package of forest functions that people and nature need. This is what a modern landscape looks like. This is Costa Rica, I believe. So you see you've got a whole bunch of different land uses across one landscape. Here's another landscape, before and after pictures of Shinyanga in Tanzania. What we do know is that a landscape is different no matter where you are, and depends on the perspectives of the people living in that landscape. So how does this fit with emerging policy frameworks? I'll just mention a few examples. At the international level, it's very interesting to see now that the word landscapes pops up as if everyone knows what it means. For example, in the new strategic plan for the Biodiversity Convention, there's reference to establishing and maintaining systems of protected areas within wider landscapes. This year, just at the end of January, beginning of February, in the UN Forum on Forests, the forest landscape restoration approach was specifically endorsed, and parties and organizations and others were encouraged to implement this approach. At the national level, there's a lot of really interesting initiatives that are popping up. In the United States, there's an actual piece of legislation with the words forest landscape restoration in it, which is part of this Omnibus Public Land Management Act. So you've got legislation, you have a budget allocated to it of up to $40 million US per year, and administrative structures in place to promote forest landscape restoration. A couple other quick examples here. This fellow is Minister Kamanzi from Rwanda. At the UN Forum on Forests, as Jan McAlpin mentioned yesterday, he made a commitment that Rwanda would restore landscapes border to border, the most significant announcement of this type ever made. The other example here is China, the Miwin Reservoir. where you have a logging ban that had been in place for many years. That policy was lifted to allow the communities to participate in sustainable forest management and restoration activities, and they're seeing the benefits of that already, as are the people of Beijing who depend on this watershed for their water supply. So some ideas, some pathways to future policy influence related to landscape approaches, and I throw these out and hope that my fellow panelists and you will react and respond to these. One idea is the need to de-emphasize the forest part. If we're talking about landscapes, really we're talking about much broader land use that cuts into other sectors, and we need to maybe not be so tied to our own jargon and our own approaches and figure out ways of reaching out into those other constituencies. Forming innovative partnerships is absolutely critical. We've seen in IUCN in the short time that we've been collaborating closely with the International Model Forest Network and other partners, we've seen the influence that we have on policymaking around landscape approaches increase dramatically. I'd like to suggest that it's important, yes, to be opportunistic when things like REDD+ come along and you think, well, we could make a contribution to that, we could tap into that funding with the work that we're doing at the landscape approach, and that is very important. But let's not forget that working at the landscape level is important in its own right. It also addresses a multitude of other needs, and I would encourage us to remain true to the principles of our approaches. Can't understate or overstate the importance of demonstration. We can only wield influence in policy arenas with fantastic examples coming from the field, so those need to continue. And finally, the importance of telling the stories with clear messages in ways that very broad audiences can understand, in ways that even ministers can understand. And I'll give you one quick example that worked very well for us. We mapped restoration potential around the world using globally available data sets. And I'm just going to quickly flip through all these slides. This map, which was produced by the World Resources Institute, South Dakota State University, and IUCN for the GPFLR, was actually produced on a very modest budget, but it has had a huge impact. It's been picked up by decision makers in a number of arenas, and has had huge interest resulting from the media, which has helped to create a lot more momentum around landscape approaches. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.